Are you guys watching the game this weekend, the Super Bowl?
I forgot it was happening until I asked someone to hang out on Sunday evening, and then I was like, wait, there's the Super Bowl.
Yeah. What about you, Naftali?
Yeah, I'll watch it. I mean,
this is the most begrudging.
Well, it feels like an ordeal. I mean, it's entertaining, but also an ordeal in a certain way.
Yeah. I was looking at a poll recently. It was from YouGov this week, and it asked people what they were most looking forward to from the Super Bowl. And it was only 30% of people who said the actual game itself. Everybody else was like, I just want to hang out with people and I want to see the commercials, which I don't have any patience for the commercials first people. From the newsroom of the Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and host of the Post Reports weekly politics roundtable. It's Thursday, February 6th. I'm joined today by Naftali Bendavid, who's a senior national political correspondent. Hey, Naftali.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we're also here today with national politics reporter Hannah Knowles. Hey, Hannah.
Hey.
So ever since Donald Trump returned to power, a major question has been what kind of checks will there be on a second Trump term, and how much further would he go than in his first term? Well, this week we're starting to get some real answers, which are not many checks and a lot further. So today we're going to break down three big stories that get at this very central question about Trump's presidency. First, we're going to dig into Trump's shocking proposal for the U.S. to, quote, take over Gaza, displace about 2 million Palestinians, and create a, quote, riviera of the Middle East. We'll be asking just how real is this and what would it mean? Then we'll talk about Trump's tariff threats and his reversal on the Canada and Mexico tariffs. And finally, we're going to dig into how Republicans in Congress are responding to all of this, and specifically how they haven't had a whole lot to say. So guys, let's start with, I think it's safe to say, one of the most surprising things that I've heard Donald Trump say, not just in his second term, but ever, and that's that the U.S. would be taking over the Gaza Strip to develop it. Let's roll the tape.
We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad. This could be so magnificent.
Now, Naftali, that was a brief clip of Trump's press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Tuesday. But Trump didn't just say this once. He really went in detail on it to some degree. Can you talk about what he proposed and give us some context for this plan that he's put forward?
Well, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the details have not been forthcoming, but it seems like essentially the idea is to persuade or force, it's not really clear, the 2 million Palestinians who live on the Gaza Strip to move and perhaps be resettled in either Jordan or Egypt. And then the United States would take it over and create, it seems like some kind of a vacation paradise. I mean, there's a way in which he seems to be looking at this like a real estate developer, like the real estate developer he was. But there's so much about this that is, I think, unrealistic or at least challenging. I mean, to just remove people from their homeland isn't something that usually works very well or perhaps is particularly a moral or ethical thing to do. All the Arab countries have reacted against it. The international community has reacted against it. But even more, I think there's a question about whether or not Americans are going to want to send Americans. He has said we won't send troops, but still, if Americans are going to be developing it, it creates a real target right in the heart of the region. I think there'd be a threat of terrorist attacks. It's kind of hard to imagine this actually happening. But Donald Trump, one of his qualities is that he likes, I think, simple answers to complex questions. You know, one of his mantras on the trail is always, that if somebody just with a little bit of boldness and daring and imagination would take something on, this complex problem, whether it's the Ukraine war or the COVID crisis, could be solved easily. And to me, this seems to fit somewhat into that category. But it's very hard to see it materializing in any kind of a real way.
Yeah, and we're starting to see some clarifications, I would say, from the White House. At Tuesday's press conference, Trump left open the idea of using U.S. troops to accomplish this. We saw his press secretary and his defense secretary on Wednesday basically saying that was on the table if need be. And then on Thursday morning, we saw Donald Trump weigh in on Truth Social and say basically that troops wouldn't be necessary, that this would actually take place after Israel had already dealt with Hamas and there would be no need for troops. I think we're always looking, Naftali, at this and wondering, like, what's Trump really getting at here? He puts an idea out there and then it's, changed slightly, and then he sees how people react and changes it up. I guess does there seem to be a plan here?
I mean, my instinct, and this is just somewhat, theoretical, is that it is more of a seat of the pants, off the cuff kind of idea. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, is there strategy here? Is it a bargaining position? Is he adopting the madman theory of international relations? We may be overthinking it. I mean, I think he just perhaps looked at it, thought this would be kind of a cool way to solve a lot of problems, and came out with it. And you're right, they've been back and forth on a lot of things. But one of the striking issues about this is one of his main messages is that the U.S. has had too many entanglements overseas, including in the Middle East. He wanted to pull back. He has a whole America First idea that involves that, we should not be getting ourselves in the middle of big, complicated problems overseas. He's been criticized for that and praised. But this seems to go completely against that. The idea of a huge American development right in the heart of the Middle East, bordering Israel and Egypt, and in the middle of the cauldron that the Middle East has been for more than a century. It does seem to run contrary to a lot of his other messages.
Yeah, Hannah, I wanted to ask you about that because, as Naftali notes, this is a president who has run on America First for his entire political career. He really launched his political career in some ways by decrying the idea of, quote, nation building in the Middle East. If you look at his past comments, he often held up the idea of nation building as not what America should be about, that we should be focused on our own people. But I haven't seen a whole lot of kind of pushback on him from Republicans and from kind of the America First crowd. What are you seeing as far as reactions to this from the people who could actually matter to affecting this proposal?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is you've seen like the MAGA base actually embrace some of Trump's like expansionist ideas. I don't think people are really into this one related to Gaza, and I think people kind of just maybe shrugged it off as like Trump being Trump or Trump saying kind of outlandish things. But, when Trump talked about, I want to take over Greenland or I want to take over Canada, right? Like his fans actually embrace that, even though it is really, raises a lot of questions about like what kind of commitments would that mean for the United States? And of course, you had the Republican, senators and Congress members who were asked immediately about Trump's Gaza comments. And my favorite quote was from Senator Tom Tillis, who said...
It's a Republican from North Carolina.
Yeah, it was something like, I think there's a lot of kinks in that slinky, which apparently is not even a phrase. Like, that's just something that Tom Tillis coined, I guess. But
yeah, it often seems like these guys kind of react initially as if like, well, I'm not going to prejudge this idea, but then they kind of say without saying that they think it's a little bit crazy. I think that was a similar comment from Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, who basically, didn't rule it out, but was kind of like, I don't know if we should be sending American troops overseas. Does that just kind of reflect the difficult balance that Republicans are dealing with right now, Hannah, where they don't want to be seen as questioning the president of their party?
For sure. Yeah. If they're pushing back, it's in the most polite way possible.
Yeah, I think we've seen that a lot, which we're going to be talking about later in the show. Naftali, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as I noted, was at that press conference on Tuesday when Trump made this announcement. I think it's worth noting that he didn't endorse this idea himself, but he looked kind of happy when Trump was saying it. I kind of wonder to the extent this was a part of a strategy from Trump, if this is some kind of a negotiating posture where, maybe the threat of the United States getting involved in the Middle East is held out there, and that's intended to get some of these countries like Saudi Arabia, maybe Iran, to do things that we want them to do or that Israel wants them to do. Is that a plausible read on what Trump is doing here?
I mean, I think it's possible. It's certainly not a novel negotiating technique to propose sort of an extreme idea. And then when you back off, people treat it as something much more reasonable than they might have otherwise. It's hard for me to know if that Trump had really thought it through quite to that degree, but it may have that effect. Bibi Netanyahu, of course, I don't think he really thinks it's going to happen, but hearing that that's where Trump is coming from, I think is something that he views very positively. It probably should be said that many people in Israel itself cringed at this idea, both because they don't think it's realistic and because, it's been called ethnic cleansing. And I mean, in some ways, it's hard to avoid looking at it that way. You're talking about removing a group of people from a place that they consider their homeland in order for somebody else to occupy it. I mean, if there's one thing we've learned throughout history, people are really attached to their homeland. I mean, people will fight for it. They will die for it. I mean, among the many reasons why this seems unlikely to become reality is that kind of just historical truth. And so I think Netanyahu was happy about it more because of where it tells us about where Trump is than because he probably believes that it's going to become a reality.
Yeah. The idea that these moves are a negotiating tactic is a thread that I think runs through another recent development with President Trump, and that is his threats of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which he pulled back on this week. They were going to take place on Monday, and then after negotiations with Canada's and Mexico's leaders, he said that he would no longer be instituting these 25% tariffs on goods from their countries. That's going to be delayed for 30 days while negotiations continue. Guys, Donald Trump has basically declared victory here and assured that he got some significant concessions from these countries. A lot of them have to do with the border. But I wanted to ask, is that kind of victory claim warranted here? And what did Trump actually get out of these negotiations?
Well, I mean, I think the things that he got are, some would call them modest. I mean, Mexico agreed to send 10,000 troops to the border, which is something they've done in the past.
In 2019 and 2021, they sent 10,000 more troops both of those years.
That's right. And Canada has agreed to several things, including appointing a fentanyl czar and also adopting a border plan that had already previously been proposed and was in the process of being adopted. But the story that Trump seems to be telling is things were really terrible. There were immigrants pouring over the southern border and fentanyl pouring over the northern border. Then I issued these threats. Now things are better. I think every part of that is probably open to some kind of challenge, but it's a story he often tells. It's a very succinct narrative and it's very politically resonant. And so I think that's kind of what he's setting up here. But I think countries are learning that if they can put themselves forward as having done something in response to Trump's action, then that may satisfy him and he may back down from his initial threat.
Yeah, and I think a kind of case in point on that is Canada's moves on fentanyl. The amount of fentanyl that crosses the border from Canada, at least the amount that has been intercepted, is 0.2%, at least it was last year, of the amount of fentanyl that makes its way across borders into the United States. So this is not, relative to the larger problem of fentanyl, Canada is not a major part of that problem. Hannah, I also wanted to talk briefly about the tariffs that did go through on Monday. Trump, along with his announced tariffs on Mexico and Canada, which he pulled back on, actually did move forward with a 10% tariff on China. He accused China of allowing fentanyl to be trafficked in the U.S. I think it's important to note that it's not clear that the tariffs are necessarily going to help with that. And China has also responded to these tariffs by saying it would levy a higher tax of 15% on certain U.S. goods. Hannah, we did see Trump do tariffs on China in his first term. We talked a lot about a trade war. How much is this similar to that, and in what ways does it differ?
Yeah, so these new ones are broader because they apply across the board. And they're also on top of existing tariffs. And so what was interesting was Joe Biden actually kept a lot of Trump's China-related tariffs in place because, they are popular when you talk to a lot of voters in the country. And so this is like if you had some goods that were under like a 25% tariff, say now you're adding 10% on top of that.
Right. I think when it comes to Trump's pullback on the Canada and Mexico tariffs, Naftali, I think it's important to note that another part of the story was what we were seeing domestically, which is there was a little bit of a tanking in the stock market. There were, of course, fears that this could lead to inflation. Trump often talks about these tariffs as kind of a win-win, like these are paid by other countries, when in fact they're costs that generally get paid by American consumers. But the idea that tariffs are good has been one of Trump's most consistent political positions. Is this a sign that maybe he touched the hot stove and got a little bit freaked about the idea that the economy could be hurt? You know, this thing that was so central in getting him elected in the first place?
I think that there definitely is an element of that. As you say, the stock market tanked right when he announced the tariffs. And we've seen in the past that the stock market is something that President Trump really cares about. While there are a few things that may serve as traditional guardrails for him, that is something that will cause him to rein in his activity. And that's certainly something that happened. But one of the most illustrative things to me is when he announced the tariffs, Chuck Grassley, who's a senator from Iowa and a Trump ally and a Republican, made a public appeal for him to make an exemption for, I think, potash, I think it was, which is a...
Is it potash or potash?
I don't know how to pronounce it.
I feel like I should know this as a native Minnesotan.
Let's just stick with fertilizer. I think that's what it is.
There we go.
But regardless, that was certainly an indication that Grassley didn't believe that those countries would be absorbing the cost. He felt that the farmers in his state would be absorbing it. And so I think there were a lot of indications. Also, a lot of members of Congress from northern states, for example, places that have car manufacturing, were very worried about the effect. So I do think that's part of what happened, is that it was communicated to him in one way or another that this might have some serious economic consequences, something that in the past he has dismissed. And I think that definitely is one of the reasons that he pulled back.
And I thought it was also notable that these were not day one items. Trump did a lot of stuff on day one. He said a lot of stuff about what he would do, including economically, and the tariffs in the end were delayed. So I do think there's probably a lot of hesitation about the details and the implementation there, even among his allies.
Yeah, and of course, we're going to see what ultimately happens with these tariffs over the next month because they're just delayed. They're not completely canceled. So very much a question that is going to persist in the near term and certainly the longer term, given Trump's focus on tariffs. After the break, we're going to get into something that we just discussed a little bit, which is the Republican pushback on Trump to the extent it exists. We'll be right back. So we've touched on this a couple times already on this show, and that's the lack of pushback on Trump and how careful Republicans especially are with questioning the things that he says he wants to do. And Hannah, you wrote a piece recently with a headline that I really, really liked. I think it really gets at what we're talking about now. The title was Donald Trump and the Incredible Shrinking Congress. Hannah, can you just summarize this story and what your reporting showed you about how Congress is reacting to Trump right now?
I think the through line over the past little more than 2 weeks of Trump's second term, in terms of the reaction from Congress, has been how little Republicans are objecting to what Trump is doing and how they're willing to not just not criticize him, but give the executive branch far more power than they would have traditionally have and not be that check. First of all, we had Trump saying, actually, we're going to give TikTok more time to comply with this banner sale law that Congress passed last year.
That passed overwhelmingly in Congress, including Republicans.
For sure, with huge bipartisan support. And the law really doesn't leave wiggle room if TikTok has not made moves toward the kind of sale that lawmakers were hoping to force, to have it not be owned by a Chinese company. And yet Trump, who just likes TikTok now because he thinks it helped him with younger voters, he decides, you know, we just don't have to really enforce it. And so that right away is blatantly kind of saying, I'm just not going to comply with this law that you passed. Then you have the Trump administration freezing federal grants and loans. You saw a little bit of pushback on that from lawmakers, and privately they were kind of scrambling to figure out what is going on, how can we dial this back? But in public, they said, oh, this is great. This is part of his crackdown on the bloated bureaucracy. And more broadly, Trump's team is interested in using something called impoundment, which is basically just the president canceling funding or reducing funding that's been appropriated by Congress. And they want to overturn court precedent on that and use that even more going forward.
And to give this some context, if I could, there was a time not that long ago when, particularly in the Senate, leaders of both parties really believed in the institutional independence and power of the Senate. And they would stand up for it, often against their own president. You think of somebody like Robert Byrd, the longtime Democratic leader from West Virginia, or Howard Baker, Republican leader from Tennessee. They cared about the Senate as an institution, and they saw it as a check and, in some cases, an adversarial chamber, when it came to the president. That seems to be, by and large, gone. I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but increasingly, both chambers of Congress seem like they're extensions of the president of their party. I mean, one thought experiment you could do, I don't want to overstate this, but look at Elon Musk and the Doge organization that he has and what they're doing. I mean, picture if Joe Biden had brought in one of his big donors to create an organization that would then go through the personal financial records of millions of Americans in the Treasury. How do you think Republicans would respond to that? Yet, when it's happening now, there's been remarkably little pushback. So I do think we're in an era where members of both parties, but we're seeing it particularly with the Republican Party now, follows the president almost no matter what he does or what he says.
Yeah, Hannah, I've been writing and really struck in recent weeks and months by a number of Republican members of Congress who have basically come forward and said, because Donald Trump won this election decisively, and, we can debate whether it was decisive. He won by about 1.5 percentage points in the popular vote. Because he won so decisively, we should basically do what he wants. Like, the American people asked for Trump, and we should give Trump what he wants. It just seems to be a real kind of justification to throw up their hands to some degree, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's the constant refrain when they're inevitably asked about, these moves Trump is taking that just make massive headlines every day. I think that the biggest challenge probably to Congress's power so far was, and Naftali alluded to this, what Doge has been doing with USAID. And that also involved
U.S. Agency for International Development.
Yeah, which at first it involved Trump by executive order saying we're going to pause foreign aid in general. And then you also saw workers at USAID, this massive agency with more than 10,000 staff, being told not to come into work. The offices were closed down, just like a total halt in their work, pretty much.
Yeah, and we've talked about the idea that Congress is kind of turning over its prerogatives to Trump and Elon Musk. But the other side of it, as Hannah just kind of alluded to, is that on some of this stuff, the things that Trump is doing don't really align with where the Republican Party has traditionally been, or the things that these Republican members of Congress have said they wanted in the past. I think tariffs is probably in line with that. The Republican Party was very much a free trade party for many years, up until recently. And then another thing we saw this week was, on the same day, Republicans in two committees voting to advance, unanimously Republicans voting to advance former Democrats as Health and Human Services Secretary and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and as Director of National Intelligence with Tulsi Gabbard. There were no Republican votes against either of them. They will move forward into the full Senate now, where we'll see what happens. I guess, Hannah, what does it say about where the Republican Party is that there didn't seem to be any kind of a conservative backlash to confirming these people?
I think it underscores what we've already said, right? That there's just not going to be significant pushback, even when they're faced with nominees who I think privately a lot of Republican senators would have had reservations with. There was like a moment of suspense last week in the confirmation hearings where you saw Tulsi Gabbard being pressed in committee on her views on Edward Snowden, and she declined to say she thought Snowden was a traitor. And that, clearly
she was pressed by Republicans on this, multiple Republicans.
Clearly upset some Republican lawmakers. You saw Bill Cassidy, who was a key swing vote for RFK Jr., really appealing him to come out and say, I don't think that autism is linked to vaccines, and he's a physician. He cares about this issue. And then in the end, they caved, and so it was a bit anticlimactic. But like, if there was going to be a moment where these Republicans came out and defied Trump, I feel like this would have been it, and then it wasn't.
Yeah. So, Naftali, what do you think are some of the big looming issues that are really going to test this kind of uneasy, consent that Republicans are giving to Trump on some of these big issues? What are the flashpoints that we're going to see in the months and years ahead that are really going to test that?
Well, it's a little hard to predict, but I do think that Trump's going to continue with his threats of tariffs and perhaps will impose some more. I think the stock market may react to that the way that it did, and that's going to be a big test. I think if he pushes ahead with some of the more dramatic threats that he's made in terms of mass deportations and building a huge facility in Guantanamo to house thousands and thousands of people, I think even pretty strongly anti-immigration Republicans may have to deal with the political fallout of that. I think one of the things I'm really going to watch in the next few months is presidents typically are at the height of their political power right after being elected. And almost inevitably in the months that follow, a little bit of buyer's remorse sets in, and often a president overreaches. That's just a fairly typical pattern. Now, Trump has defied political rules for years, and so maybe that won't happen with him. Obviously, he has tremendous clout within the party, and I think that's one reason that so many Republicans are sort of swallowing hard and going along. But what the political dynamics are in the months to come, I think is going to be very critical to see if this pattern that we've been talking about continues.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that we'll all be watching Donald Trump's approval rating, which has been higher than it has been historically, really higher than ever before, and where that goes in the weeks and months ahead. And if it goes down, will we see Republicans start to kind of draw harder lines with him on the things he wants to do? I think it's a fair question. Hannah, a related piece of this that I wanted to get to and bring in some of our reporting on this is the idea of quote unquote flooding the zone. What are you seeing from Democrats as far as the battles that they're picking right now?
Democrats have really leaned into making Elon Musk the villain, which is interesting. And they feel like, having this unelected billionaire, as they phrase it, who is essentially trying to run a lot of the government now without the consent of Congress and take an axe to all these federal agencies, they feel like that's really a winning issue. And so it is kind of funny for the thing that they've zeroed in on to not be Donald Trump, although obviously it's all about Donald Trump at the end of the day. But they're sort of picking that as their really key message right now. And I think when you talk to Democratic lawmakers, there is a bit of a sense of helplessness of we can vote against his cabinet picks. We can shout from the top of the rooftops that we think this stuff is bad, but they'll say openly, I just don't think a lot of the American public is listening right now, and we have to figure out how to change that.
And one of the few venues that they have is the courts, for the very reasons that Hannah was talking about. Politically, they don't have a lot of options. But many Democratic groups, or at least liberal groups, have taken various actions of Trump to the courts. And they've even started having some success on things like birthright citizenship or the spending freeze that we talked about. There was a recent ruling against Trump on the question of transgender prisoners and where they should be housed. And so I think for a lot of the Democrats, even as they throw up their hands, at least for the moment, on the political arena, are looking to the judicial arena as a venue where maybe they can have some successes.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's worth noting that the courts take a while to work their way through things. And of course, we have seen the Supreme Court sometimes check Donald Trump in his first term, but they also gave him some significant things recently, including a broad grant of immunity that we hadn't seen for a president before. That could certainly be a major part of what we experience over the next few years. Guys, we're going to leave it there for now. Thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Hannah Knowles is a national politics reporter, and Naftali Bendavid is a senior national political correspondent for The Post. If you're tuning in via the Campaign Moment show feed, please make sure to go follow Post Reports and The Seven for even more politics coverage throughout the week. Today's episode was produced by Peter Bresnan and mixed by Sam Bair. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Rachel Van Dongen. I'm Aaron Blake. See you next time.